It's interesting how often the lectionary readings that are set, well, there's a rotation of them. And it's interesting how so often something that's already been set speaks so loudly to what's happened in this past week, or in the time in which it comes up. Some time ago, when I was off in March, or in February, I took a look ahead and sort of spelled out the themes for the next few weeks during Lent. And the theme that came up for this week, as I looked at the passages, the theme I thought was being suggested with these readings, was the whole idea of lament. And in the week that we've just had, who could not be lamenting, crying, thinking about some of the things that have happened in this past week. The air disaster in Ethiopia, and then more recently the incredibly brutal planned massacre that took place in a house of worship in New Zealand. And so the whole world weeps as Jesus wept over Jerusalem. Now, the reason that Jesus was weeping over Jerusalem was because here in this holy city, here in this holy place where so much good could happen, so much evil could also happen. You see, at the time, the belief was that Jesus resided, or that God resided in the temple in Jerusalem. That was the holy place. That was the Holy of Holies. And so sometimes when that kind of power is concentrated, that kind of trust, that kind of respect is concentrated in one place, the potential for abuse can be very high. And so those people who resided, and the religious leaders and the political leaders, because they felt that God resided there, they came to believe that they were God and that they could kill prophets or anybody else that they chose. So again, we see an incredible abuse of power, of trust, of people. And so here was Jesus on his way to Jerusalem, because being the holy place, he was beginning his pilgrimage to Jerusalem, again, to celebrate the Passover. And he was sort of en route, and they said, keep away from here, because Herod, one of the most brutal, sadistic leaders the world has ever seen, is trying to kill you. Now, we know that Herod was trying to kill Jesus from the time he was born. The fear and the threat of something that might displace him from power was so strong. Remember a part of our Christmas story that Herod decrees that all children under the age of 2 are to be massacred. So that by putting that blanket statement on, he feels that he can get rid of this supposed new king that's come among them. But Jesus' parents, warned in a dream, slipped away off to Egypt and lived as refugees until it was safe to return. And so here we have, many years later, not the boy Jesus, but the man Jesus, who is once again going to this holy place and once again being warned that ill may come of this. Now, this is an old story, but it's also a new story, isn't it? And when we see the kind of abuse that sometimes happens in holy places, abuse from within, abuse from without. A gunman walks into a mosque in New Zealand, in Christchurch, and has already set up a feed that this can be all filmed and shown around the world. I was very, very impressed the other night when I watched the CBC News, and they had blacked out, they had said, we're not showing that. That's what this person wants, and so we're not going to show it. And so people not, once it was taken down from Facebook and other places, just not showing it. This person wanted their 15 minutes of fame, and so killed 50 people and critically injured many, many more. And we say to ourselves, what's going on with the world? What's gone wrong with the world? And then when we read these stories, we realize that these kinds of things have been with us a long time. Those of us in the Western world have not seen this kind of thing as much. And we're seeing it more now, and it's shocking. And yet there it was 2,000 years ago, a similar kind of thing. And what is it that people get a sense of trust, people get a sense of power, and it becomes too much, and then they cross the line and move into a time when they abuse that kind of power, and then that which came from power just crumbles away. At this time, the whole sense of God being in Jerusalem was crumbling away. The whole sense was just falling away because power had been abused, trust had been abused, and now along came Jesus, who said, it doesn't matter. God is everywhere. God is not in one place. God is everywhere, and that's why I've come, to show you that God is not resident in one place or with one people exclusively, but God is everywhere that we are. Everywhere, God is already there first. And so you might say, if God is already there, then why are these things happening? Why does this happen? Now that's a whole sermon series in itself, and I won't get into it right now, but simply to say, we are all human. And humans make mistakes, humans also make choices. And the other thing I think that we need to appreciate, which I probably didn't appreciate until, many years into my ministry. I thought, well, evil doesn't really exist, it's just kind of, we have to counter that. But evil does exist. And evil exists in places, and the only way that we can counter that is with love. Hatred doesn't do anything except bring out more evil. And the only way that we can speak to that is through loving actions. Now that doesn't mean that we love what evil does or what hatred does. We speak against it, we work against it. But we can't allow ourselves to be infected with that kind of disease called hatred, because it will destroy us and everything around us and everything that's important to us. I don't know what possessed this person to open fire in a mosque when people were praying. I don't know what possesses people to go into a church, as they have in the Coptic churches in Egypt, as they have many times in churches in the United States, and open fire on people who are worshiping, who are reaching out to something beyond themselves to make sense of it. But I do know that evil corrupts, and evil kills prophets. Jesus said, Jerusalem wept, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you killed prophets. That's why he couldn't be there, because they would kill him, and we know that they eventually did. And where did they kill him? Just outside the walls of Jerusalem. So that they could say, see, we didn't kill him in Jerusalem. They took him out to Calvary. This is just beyond the wall, just beyond the walled city. At the time, that was the whole of Jerusalem. So Jesus wept. Jesus wept over what he saw. Jesus wept many, many times. He wept over the death of his friend Nazareth. He wept over Jerusalem. There were many times when Jesus saw things that were happening and he wept. He cried because he was sad, because he was angry, because his own human emotions overtook him. So many times when I have been conducting a funeral or sitting with a family when they've heard very troubling news, or talking with people about disasters that have happened, and somebody will start to cry, and they will apologize to me and say, oh, I'm really sorry, I don't mean to cry. My answer is to them, go ahead. Tears cleanse the soul. It's healthy for us. And Jesus cried many, many times over things that he saw that were wrong, that were unjust, that needed to change. And so he wept. There is nothing wrong. In fact, the first step in making things right in the world is to weep. To realize in our profound grief and our profound confusion and anger that this is very wrong. Now, Jesus didn't stop at his tears. He wept. And then he moved on. And he moved on to do the things that would make our world a better place. And sometimes, because we're human, we can get caught up in those really painful, sad things, can't we? Sometimes it takes us a while to move past those things. And we think about a time when you've lost somebody very important to you. You don't just get over that overnight. You don't just get over that in a month or two. And everybody takes a different length of time and a different course of action to move past these deep hurts that we all have in life. And so that's our first task when we see this kind of injustice, or when injustice happens to us, is to take the time to look and to feel it, and to know that that's okay. And that too is part of God's response. And then as we begin to heal from that, as Jesus did, to be able to say, what do I need to do now, next, to make sure, if it's an injustice, that this doesn't happen again to me, or to somebody I know, or to somebody perhaps I don't know, but God knows them. And so what can I do? Now, sometimes when we get to that step, it can be just downright overwhelming, can't it? Because there's just so much. And so we pick out one tiny little thing that we can do to make it right, to make it better. This was one little tiny thing that you did when I was away. You gave some money and some thought and some time and some prayers to the Women's Rural Resource Center. I had the opportunity recently, just by chance, to talk with somebody, not in Strathroy, but just who was involved, who was one of the people who was saved saved from a difficult situation, and talking practically here, through the Women's Rural Resource Center. It literally saved her life. And so supporting something like this is one little step. It may seem like a little step, but for that woman that I spoke to, all those little steps came together and saved her life. Literally, saved her life. So those are the things that we do. What can we do when we see something like what happens in Jerusalem? What can we do when we see something like what happens more recently in Christchurch? And then I remembered this individual held as some of his heroes people who had done similar things. And one of the people that he named was the young man in Quebec City who did the same thing and opened fire in a mosque. And then I remember the next part of that story. Because the next day, when people, or whenever the worshippers were gathering again to pray, everybody circled the mosque in Quebec City. Christians, Muslims, Jews, people that didn't claim any particular faith, they circled that mosque and said, we will not allow people not to be able to go into their house of worship and worship as they choose. That's an incredible, incredible story that just arose by men and women, you and I. We've been there. I'm sure some of us would have been in that circle, just saying, we're here. We're protecting one another's backs because this kind of thing cannot happen. And for us as Christians, this is the kind of thing that Jesus spoke against. This is the kind of thing that if Jesus had been alive, he would be in that circle around that mosque in Quebec, and he would be outside that mosque in Christchurch, holding those and weeping with those who were broken. And he would also be standing with the person, and this is the hard thing for a lot of us, with the person who had taken that gun and gone in and standing and loving him into a new creation. That's hard sometimes for us to hear, that God loves us all. Even the people that we don't love and never can find it in our hearts to love, somehow He is able to do that. Yesterday I read a very powerful piece in the Golden Mail about, it was a letter that a young woman had written to the man who was involved in the Broncos crash a year or so ago, who was going to be sentenced this week. And she echoed the words of the mother of one of the young men that was killed, and she said, a similar thing happened to me, and I lost my mother several years ago, and I finally came to forgive the person. And I hope, Mr. Sadhu, that you will be able to forgive yourself for what happens. Sometimes these things are accidents, as they were in that dreadful crash a year ago. And sometimes they are the actions of the power of darkness, the power of evil. That's what we are called to do in our Lenten journey as we continue on our road to the cross, to name injustice and to name evil for what it is, and then to act. To act in the way that you can, whether that's helping to protect somebody in a line around a house of worship, whether that is holding people in prayer, whether that is reaching out to a neighbor and saying, welcome, I'm glad you're here. Let's have a conversation. So I'll leave that with you. It's a hard passage to hear, and these are hard things to come to grips with. But this is still a good world, and this is a world where Jesus, I was going to say if He was here today, but He is here. He's here every time we open our eyes, we see Him. So remember that. Each time we see somebody, we are looking at the face of Christ, the Christ who gives us the power to speak against darkness. Thanks be to God.